My name is Casey Sullivan. I'm 34, and last Thanksgiving was the night everything exploded. I pulled up to my parents' house in Northeast Heights, Albuquerque, carrying the pumpkin pie I'd spent all morning baking. The porch light was on the windows, glowed warm, and I could hear laughter spilling out before I even rang the bell. The door opened. My younger brother Ryder stood there in a ridiculous turkey apron, looked me straight in the eye, and said, "You're not welcome here. Go mess up someone else's holiday." I glanced past him. Mom was setting the table, Dad carving the turkey, Aunt Angela passing the rolls. Grandma Norma already in her usual chair, everyone smiling like the past 3 years had never happened. I just said, understood, turned around, and walked back to my car. I hadn't even made it off the street when my phone started blowing up. Dad, Aunt Angela, Grandma Norma. Unknown numbers. Over and over. If you want to know why my own brother slammed the door in my face on Thanksgiving, and why 30 minutes later, the entire family was suddenly desperate to talk to me, stay until the end because this one gets ugly. Like, share, and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what happened next. Let's get into it. I'd barely driven a few blocks from the house when my phone refused to stop buzzing. 25 minutes after Ryder had shut the door in my face, I turned the car around and headed back. The porch light still glowed, but now the front door hung wide open and Dad stood there in just a thin shirt, arms crossed tight against the freezing Albuquerque night. His face looked redder than the desert clay after a rainstorm, and the way he motioned me inside told me everything had changed in half an hour. The second I stepped through the doorway, the warmth hit me along with complete silence. Mom sat frozen at the dining table, phone clutched in both hands. Aunt Angela and Uncle Victor hovered behind her, staring at the same screen. Grandma Norma had her reading glasses perched low on her nose, lips pressed into a hard line. The turkey sat half-carved and forgotten candles flickering like nothing had happened yet. Everything clearly had. Dad closed the door behind me and spoke without looking at anyone else. "Read it out loud, Cheryl." Mom's voice shook as she started reading the email that had arrived from Jonathan Gray, the attorney who managed the Sullivan Family Revocable Living Trust Dad set up years ago. The subject line alone made my stomach drop. Preliminary notice of irregularities. Jonathan wrote that during a routine audit triggered by Dad's long recovery, his office discovered multiple withdrawals totaling hundreds of thousands of dollars over the past 26 months. The transfers lacked proper documentation, the electronic signatures didn't match Dad's known pattern, and every single login came from an IP address registered to the same residential service used at my younger brother Ryder Sullivan's house in Rio Rancho and at his wife Riley's salon. I felt every pair of eyes shift to me at once. 3 years earlier, when Dad was still in the hospital after the accident that broke his collarbone, several ribs, and gave him a mild traumatic brain injury, Ryder had been named temporary successor trustee because Dad couldn't manage anything himself. I remembered noticing one small withdrawal back then, maybe $8,000, and when I asked Mom about it, she brushed it off as normal trust fees. I believed her. I was busy holding down my job, visiting the hospital every day, and trying to keep the rest of life together, so I let it go. Ryder finally spoke from the doorway to the kitchen, arms folded, voice dripping with that familiar defensiveness. "This is insane. Those withdrawals were all approved. Dad needed things while he was laid up. Medical equipment, home care." "You mean the new truck Uncle Victor cut in quietly, or the down payment on the bigger house?" Riley stepped forward beside Ryder, clutching his arm like a shield. "You're blowing this completely out of proportion. Ryder was handling everything while your dad couldn't even sign his own name. He was protecting the money." Grandma Norma set her glass down hard enough to make the silverware jump. "Protecting it straight into your bank accounts from the look of these numbers." Ryder's face went blotchy. "I have receipts. I have explanations for every single." Dad didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. When he finally spoke, the words came out flat and final, the way only a man who's spent months staring at hospital ceilings can deliver them. "Get out of my house. Both of you. Tonight. Riley gasped. Howard, I said tonight. Dad pointed toward the hallway. Pack whatever you came with and leave. The locks will be changed before morning. Mom started crying quietly into her hands, but she didn't stand up to stop it. Aunt Angela moved to her side, rubbing her back in slow circles. Uncle Victor just shook his head, eyes on the floor. Ryder opened his mouth like he might argue, glanced at Dad's expression, and thought better of it. Riley grabbed her purse from the couch, tears already starting, and followed him down the hall. We heard drawers slamming, a few muffled curses, the rustle of coats being yanked from the closet. 10 minutes later, the front door shut behind them with a click that sounded louder than any scream. The house felt suddenly too big and too quiet, the smell of turkey and pumpkin pie turning sour in the air. Dad walked straight past the table, past all of us, and disappeared into his study without another word. I stood there in my coat, the pie still ridiculous in my hands, wondering how the night had flipped so completely in less than an hour. The months that followed passed in a heavy silence that seemed to settle over everything like dust after a desert wind. Mom and Dad fought almost every night, their voices carrying through the thin walls of the house whenever I stopped by to check on Dad's physical therapy progress. Mom kept insisting Ryder had only been trying to help during the long recovery, that the numbers were being twisted somehow, and that I should drop the whole thing before it tore the family apart for good. Dad refused to listen, growing quieter and more withdrawn, with every argument spending hours in his study, staring at old hiking maps of the Sandia Mountains he hadn't been able to climb since the accident. I stopped answering Mom's calls altogether, and only stayed in touch with Dad and Grandma Norma, who both texted me short updates about appointments and how the latest audit was going. The only person I actually talked to every single day was my best friend Ellis Ford, the one constant who had been there through every canceled family event over the past 3 years. Ellis would swing by my apartment after her shift at the university lab, bring takeout from Los Polos on Central Avenue, and let me vent without ever telling me what I should do. One gray February morning, a thick envelope arrived from Jonathan Gray's office. I opened it at the kitchen table while Ellis poured us coffee, and the official report laid everything out in cold, clear detail. Over 26 months, exactly $342,000 had moved out of the trust through a series of transfers that all traced back to accounts controlled by Ryder and Riley. Some went toward the down payment on their bigger house in Rio Rancho, another chunk paid for Riley's new salon space on Southern Boulevard, and the rest covered a lifted truck, private school tuition deposits, and a long list of home renovations that suddenly made sense when I thought about the photos they'd been posting online. Dad called that same afternoon asking if we could all meet at the house the following Saturday. No excuses. When I walked in, the dining room table was already covered with printed copies of the report, highlighters scattered like evidence at a crime scene. Grandma Norma sat at one end, gripping her cane, Aunt Angela and Uncle Victor on the couch, looking uncomfortable, and Mom stood by the window, twisting a tissue into knots. Dad didn't waste time on small talk. He slid the main report across the table toward Mom and waited until she finally picked it up. She scanned the pages, her face getting paler with every line, but when she reached the end, she just shook her head and whispered that there had to be some mistake, that Ryder would never do something like this on purpose. Dad's voice stayed low and steady, the same tone he used when he first taught me to parallel park. He stole from his own sister. Mom dropped the papers like they burned her and started crying in big heaving sobs that filled the whole room. Aunt Angela reached for her hand, but Mom pulled away and kept repeating that we were ruining Ryder's life over nothing. Uncle Victor tried to calm things down by suggesting everyone take a breath, yet nobody moved. Grandma Norma finally spoke up, telling Mom she had raised one child who told the truth, no matter the cost, and another who took what wasn't his, and it was time to face which one she was still protecting. After what felt like forever, Dad disappeared into the study and came back with a thin folder. Inside were trial separation papers he'd already had drawn up at a lawyer's office downtown. He placed them on the table next to the report and told Mom she could sign whenever she was ready, but he wasn't going to keep pretending everything was fine. Mom stared at the pages for a long time, tears dripping onto the wood, then picked up the pen with shaking fingers and signed her name. Dad signed right after, and just like that, the marriage I'd grown up watching became something temporary, something that might not survive the year. I left before anyone tried to hug me or apologize or explain anything else. The drive home felt longer than usual, the city lights blurring together through the windshield, and when Ellis opened her door later that night, she didn't ask questions, just handed me a blanket and turned on the basketball game we both pretended to care about. The spring after that awful Thanksgiving, the civil lawsuit was officially filed at the Bernalillo County District Court. Ryder wasted no time hiring a defense attorney from Santa Fe who specialized in trust disputes and came with a reputation for dragging cases out as long as possible. The first documents arrived at my apartment in a plain manila envelope, thick with motions to dismiss and requests for extensions that felt designed to wear everyone down before anything even started. Dad refused to back off covering the filing fees himself and telling me over coffee one morning that he'd sell the old camping gear if he had to, just to see this through. I spent weeks preparing to testify, gathering every screenshot, every bank alert I'd saved from 3 years earlier when the withdrawals first caught my eye. When the day finally came, I drove downtown early, parked near the courthouse on 4th Street, and walked into the hearing room trying to keep my hands from shaking. Ryder sat at the defense table in a suit that looked rented, avoiding my eyes while his lawyer argued that any transfers had been made in good faith during Dad's recovery period. I took the stand, answered questions about what I'd noticed and why I hadn't let it go, and laid out the timeline as clearly as I could without letting my voice crack. The judge listened without expression, making notes that would decide how much of my share I'd ever see again. 2 weeks before the first full hearing, Riley filed for divorce at the same courthouse, citing irreconcilable differences and making sure the paperwork stated she wanted no part of any joint debts. The timing wasn't lost on anyone. By separating legally, she protected whatever assets she still had from being touched by the judgment we were all waiting for. Dad just nodded when I told him, saying it made sense in a sad way and that he wasn't surprised anymore. Ryder's job at the financial planning firm ended almost overnight once Human Resources received the official court notice. They called him in for a meeting on a Tuesday, handed him a box for his personal items, and walked him out the same afternoon. Word spread quickly through the local business community, and soon his LinkedIn went dark. The professional headshot replaced with a generic silhouette that made him look like a ghost of who he used to be. The case dragged on through depositions and discovery, each side requesting more documents while the interest on the claimed amount kept climbing. Dad's attorney stayed patient, filing responses on time and keeping us updated with short emails that always ended the same way: "We're moving forward." I kept working my regular shifts at the bookstore near the university, coming home to Ellis, waiting with questions about how the day went and whether I needed anything stronger than tea. Nearly 2 years after the lawsuit was first filed, the final judgment came down on a quiet Thursday morning. The judge ruled entirely in our favor, ordering Ryder to repay the full $342,000, plus compounded interest and all attorney fees, bringing the total well beyond $500,000. The amount was so far out of reach that even Ryder's Santa Fe lawyer looked stunned when he read the order aloud in court, shaking his head like he'd never seen numbers land quite that hard. Dad called me right after leaving the courthouse, his voice lighter than it had been in months, saying the trust could finally start distributing what was left once restitution began. I thanked him and hung up before the relief fully hit, because winning on paper didn't feel like winning when the family photos on my shelf still showed all of us smiling together years earlier. By the end of the second summer, everything Ryder had built collapsed completely. He and Riley, even after the divorce was final, both filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy within days of each other. Their separate attorneys coordinated just enough to make sure the massive civil judgment became the centerpiece of both cases, wiping out whatever assets the court could still reach. The trustee handling the bankruptcy sent me a short letter confirming that the debt to the family trust would be discharged, like any other, meaning the money was simply gone for good. The house in Rio Rancho went into foreclosure soon after. I drove past it once on my way to pick up hiking gear for Dad, and saw the bright orange notice taped to the front door, weeds already growing tall in the xeriscaped yard they used to brag about on social media. A moving truck sat in the driveway for 2 days while strangers carried out furniture and boxes, and then the bank's lockbox appeared on the knob, like the final punctuation mark on that chapter of their lives. Riley packed what little she kept and moved south to Los Lunas to live with her mother in a small adobe house near the river. She changed her phone number, deleted every trace of the Sullivan name from her online profiles, and never responded to the single message Mom sent asking if she was all right. The silence from that direction became permanent, as clean a cut as any legal document could provide. Mom refused to accept the new reality at first. She kept sending Ryder long text messages, begging him to come talk to Dad, promising she would smooth everything over if he would just show up and apologize. Dad's response was immediate and unchanging. Ryder was no longer welcome in the house under any circumstances, and the gate code had been changed the same week the judgment came down. Mom would read Dad's short replies aloud in the kitchen, voice trembling, then stare at her phone, waiting for a son who never answered. One afternoon in early September, Jonathan Gray called to tell me the trust was finally in a position to distribute my original share now that the bankruptcy had closed. A few weeks later, a wire transfer appeared in my account with an amount that matched what should have been there all along, minus the legal fees Dad had quietly covered. I sat looking at the confirmation screen for a long time, feeling none of the satisfaction I thought would come. When Ellis asked what the money meant to me now, all I could manage was a shrug and the quiet truth that slipped out before I could stop it. I didn't get my family back. The words hung in the air between us, heavier than any dollar figure ever could. Ellis didn't try to argue or fix it. She just poured more coffee and let the silence stretch until the sun moved across the kitchen floor. Dad started spending weekends clearing out the garage, donating old tools and camping equipment he no longer needed, turning the space into a small woodworking shop where he could disappear for hours at a time. Mom stayed in her bedroom more often, curtains drawn even on the bright desert mornings, the house growing quieter with every passing month. I kept the checkbook balanced, and the apartment plants alive went to work and came home and slowly stopped expecting anything to feel normal again. Some losses, I learned, come with paperwork, and some come without, but they all leave the same empty space where people used to be. 2 years after that Thanksgiving, Dad had recovered completely. He was back to hiking the steep trails up the Sandia Mountains every weekend, sometimes leaving before sunrise with a full pack and returning after dark with dirt on his boots and a quiet smile he hadn't worn in years. His strength returned faster than any doctor predicted, and watching him move through the house without pain reminded me how close we had come to losing him entirely after the accident. He started planning longer trips again, talking about retracing the Continental Divide trail sections he'd missed while stuck in physical therapy. Mom stayed alone in the old house on the edge of Northeast Heights, the rooms growing dimmer as she rarely opened the curtains anymore. She spoke less with each passing month, answering questions with single words or small nods, spending most afternoons in the recliner with a blanket pulled to her shoulders, even when the desert heat pushed past 90. Meals became simple things she heated in the microwave, and the garden Dad once tended together with her turned brown and brittle under the relentless sun. Aunt Angela and Uncle Victor made the decision without ceremony one spring morning. They blocked Mom's number, and Ryder's removed themselves from every family group chat and sent a single short email explaining they could not stay connected to people who refused to acknowledge what had been done. After that, birthday cards stopped arriving from their side, and the yearly summer barbecue they used to host simply never appeared on the calendar again. Grandma Norma weakened steadily as the family stress and her age finally caught up with her. She spent more days in bed than out of it, the cane replaced by a walker and then by nurses who came to the house 3 times a week. Dad visited every afternoon, bringing green chili stew or whatever fruit was in season, sitting by her bedside while she dozed. One October evening, she asked me to come alone. When I arrived, she pressed a folded envelope into my hand, her fingers thin and cool against mine. She managed a tired smile and told me to read it later after she was gone. She passed quietly 3 nights later at 89, slipping away, while Dad held one hand and I held the other. The funeral was small, just immediate family and a few old neighbors who remembered her from church potlucks decades earlier. We buried her beside Grandpa on a windy hill overlooking the city, the mountains sharp against the sky behind us. That night, I sat on my apartment balcony with Ellis and finally opened the letter. The handwriting was shaky but steady enough to read every word. Casey, you did the hardest thing a person can do. You chose what was right when it would have been easier to look away. I watched you carry this family when no one else would, and I need you to know I'm proud of you every single day. Always choose integrity. It's the only thing no one can take from you. Love always. Grandma Norma. I read it twice, then folded it back into the envelope and slipped it into the small wooden box where I keep things I never want to lose. Ellis stayed quiet beside me, the city lights flickering far below while the wind carried the scent of piñon from the foothills. Dad kept climbing higher, with every trip marking new trails on his maps in red ink. Mom's house stayed dark most evenings now, a single lamp glowing in the living room, like a signal that never quite went out. I drove past sometimes on my way to somewhere else, and never slowed down the distance, feeling both necessary and permanent. The empty spaces grew familiar the way grief does when it decides to stay. Some mornings I woke up and forgot for a moment that anything had changed. Then the weight settled back in place, heavier because it was quieter. Grandma Norma's words became the only family voice I still carried inside my head, steady and kind, reminding me why I had done what I did. Today, I drove through Northeast Heights and pulled over in front of the old house one more time. I left the engine running and stayed behind the wheel, hands resting on the steering wheel, while the late afternoon sun turned the stucco walls the color of faded sandstone. Nothing had changed on the outside. The same cracked driveway, the same juniper bushes Dad planted the year I started high school, the same mailbox that still carried the Sullivan name in peeling vinyl letters. Mom's car sat under the carport, dusty and unmoved, for days. I didn't get out. I never do anymore. My phone buzzed against the passenger seat. An unknown number. I almost ignored it until a photo loaded beneath the preview. Ryder and me at 8 and 6, sunburned and grinning on the trampoline in the backyard, arms slung around each other like nothing could ever pull us apart. The message underneath was only 3 lines. Casey, please, can we talk? I have nothing left. I stared at the picture longer than I meant to. The little girl in the photo still believed her brother would always have her back. I felt something twist low in my chest, sharp and familiar, then let the screen go dark. My thumb hovered for half a second before I hit block and deleted the thread. The photo disappeared with everything else he'd tried to send over the past year, the emails from new addresses, the voicemails left at 2 a.m, the single birthday card that arrived 6 months late with no return address. Everyone met the same fate. I put the car in drive and pulled away without looking in the rearview mirror. Ryder lives in a 1-bedroom apartment off Central now, the kind with bars on the windows and a view of a parking lot. He works night shift stocking shelves because no financial firm in the state will touch his resume after what came out in court. The truck is gone, the house is gone, the credit is ruined for the next decade. Riley remarried someone quiet who keeps her far away from anything with our last name on it. Mom still lives in the old house alone, waiting for a son who will never be allowed through the door again. Dad hikes every chance he gets higher and farther each season, like distance is the only thing that still feels clean. I chose the truth when staying silent would have been easier. I chose it when Mom begged me to drop everything, when Ryder swore it was all a misunderstanding, when the easiest path was pretending none of it happened. That choice cost me the family I grew up in, the holidays I thought would last forever, the version of my brother I used to believe in. Some nights I still feel the weight of that cost pressing against my ribs like a bruise that never quite heals, but I have never regretted it. Not for 1 second. Because the alternative was teaching myself to live with a lie, and I decided a long time ago that some things are worth more than comfort. Integrity is one of them. Peace that comes from looking the other way is never real peace at all. So yes, Ryder has nothing left. He lost everything he stole and everything he was given. And I lost the brother I once knew. But I kept the person I need to be when I look in the mirror every morning. Sometimes protecting your own decency means cutting off the very people who share your blood. Sometimes love isn't enough to fix what greed and betrayal break. And sometimes the hardest thing you will ever do is refuse to carry someone else's shame just to keep the family photo looking perfect. That is the truth I live with now. That is the line I will never cross again. To everyone who stayed until the very end, thank you. Thank you for listening, for sitting with the hard parts, for letting this story matter. If anything in it hit close to home, please share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever had to choose between family and what you knew was right? How did you carry the cost? I read every single one, and your stories helped me carry mine.